I walked into the Tuesday morning strategy session expecting the usual rhythm. Budget reviews, client updates, maybe a debate about infrastructure scaling. The conference room smelled like burnt coffee and the faint ozone scent from the projector that had been running since sunrise. Nothing suggested what was about to detonate my entire career. 15 years as a lead systems architect had taught me to sense tension before anyone spoke. But when I saw Dennis Cole sitting at the head of the table with his hands folded like a poker player holding aces, his expression carved from stone, I knew this meeting had nothing to do with our quarterly goals. I settled into my chair and opened my notebook. Dennis didn't glance at the agenda. He stared at his phone as if timing something invisible to the rest of us. 3 minutes passed before he stood and delivered what he probably rehearsed in the mirror that morning. Starting immediately, I'm pleased to announce that Dominic will assume the position of Chief Innovation Officer at Arkite Technologies. The silence that followed felt like someone had sucked the oxygen from the room. Dominic, Dennis's son. The same kid who had relocated from Boston 4 months ago and spent most of that time attending networking brunches and posting motivational quotes on social media. Now, he was leading innovation for a company I had architected from a basement server setup. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe so you never miss another powerful story. And let me know your thoughts on today's one in the comments. I read every message. The door swung open, and Dominic entered wearing a suit that looked expensive enough to intimidate and uncomfortable enough to suggest he'd never worn one before yesterday. His smile stretched wide, the kind you practice before a mirror when you're trying to convince yourself you belong somewhere. He circled the table, shaking hands like a candidate running for office. I watched him move and thought about the nights I spent debugging until my eyes burned and the weekends I sacrificed to keep our infrastructure alive. And now this. Dennis caught my eye and nodded slightly, the nod that said everything had already been decided before we arrived. I didn't react. In corporate hierarchies, showing emotion is the fastest way to lose whatever leverage you have left. Then, Dominic began his introduction. His voice carried the rehearsed cadence of someone who had consumed too many TED Talks and believed confidence could substitute for knowledge. He spoke about transformation, synergy, and disruption, his tone rising as if he expected applause after every sentence. But he never mentioned a single metric. No data points, no architectural diagrams, no technical roadmap. Just buzzwords strung together like decorations on a tree with no roots. The engineer beside me, a back-end specialist named Colin, shot me a look that said everything words couldn't. I kept my face neutral and waited to see how far Dennis would let this theater continue. Dominic moved into cloud infrastructure, and that's when the disaster began. He described our deployment pipeline as if it were a content management system, mixing terminology so badly that 2 senior developers actually winced. The room froze for exactly 2 seconds, long enough for everyone to register the mistake, too short for anyone to risk pointing it out. That's how power works. Everyone sees the problem. No one says a word. Dominic clicked through a few more slides. I sat motionless. Sometimes silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the only way to watch carefully and decide what comes next. The meeting ended with polite applause that sounded more like obligation than enthusiasm. Dominic made another lap around the table. I smiled the way you smile when a neighbor shows you the car they crashed, but insist runs perfectly. Dennis met my eyes briefly, half relieved, half evasive. I returned to my desk where my monitor still displayed the module I'd been refactoring the night before. A subtle memory leak I could patch in 15 minutes, but when I opened the repository, I saw Dominic had been inside. He'd rearranged functions, altered logic flows, and inserted a segment of code that was fundamentally broken. I knew immediately this was only the beginning. Systems don't collapse from a single catastrophic failure. They crumble from small fractures everyone chooses to ignore. I stared at the screen and felt the structure I'd spent years building tilt 1 degree off balance. Before I continue, tell me where you're listening from. I love knowing where these stories reach, sometimes places I never imagined. I stared at the broken code Dominic had left behind, and instead of frustration, I felt something else, a strange pull backward, like my mind was asking how I ended up here in the first place. I grew up in Detroit, a city where winter doesn't just arrive, it occupies. I started programming at 14. On a refurbished desktop my uncle salvaged from an office liquidation sale. The machine overheated if I ran anything remotely demanding, but I didn't care. Every successful compile felt like proof I'd found the thing I was meant to do. No one in my family understood what I was building on that screen, but they understood the look on my face when something finally worked. From that moment forward, I knew this field would define my life. I met Dennis Cole at a developer conference in Chicago. He wasn't the kind of speaker who relied on flashy slides. He talked about building a platform for secure enterprise communications, and he spoke with the conviction of someone who genuinely believed in what he was creating. Arkite Technologies was hemorrhaging money at the time, barely surviving on a shoestring budget, and investor patience was wearing thin. But Dennis didn't sound like someone ready to give up. I listened to him for nearly half an hour, and for the first time in years, I felt like someone was describing a vision I wanted to be part of. When he asked if I'd consider joining Arkite, I agreed before he finished the sentence. My first day at the company felt like stepping into controlled chaos. A cramped office with 5 people, outdated equipment, and a server rack held together with zip ties and stubborn optimism. Most people would have turned around and left. I felt like I'd come home. Limited resources never frightened me. Only the absence of purpose did. And Arkite, struggling as it was, had more purpose than any polished corporation I'd ever seen. Dennis, in those early years, was relentless. He arrived before anyone else, stayed later than everyone, and carried an optimism so unshakable, I sometimes wondered if he'd actually looked at our financial reports. One night, while we battled a system failure that threatened to lose our only major client, he turned to me and said something I never forgot. When we hit $1 billion valuation, Jeffrey, you'll have equity that reflects what you've built here. I wasn't someone who trusted promises easily, but something in his voice made that one feel real. The years that followed consumed me completely. I rewrote our entire back-end infrastructure so we could scale without expensive third-party dependencies. I built a real-time error detection system so we didn't have to wake up every night wondering if the servers had crashed. I redesigned our data architecture to extract performance from hardware most companies would have thrown away. Some nights I slept in the office, listening to the server hum like a heartbeat, terrified and exhilarated at the same time. Those early years exhausted me in ways I'd never experienced. They were also the years I felt most alive. Arkite started landing contracts, small ones first, then larger, then clients we never imagined we'd serve. Every efficiency I engineered became fuel for the next phase of growth. When a potential investor asked how we processed data so quickly at such low cost, Dennis just grinned and said we had a secret weapon. That weapon was me, and a custom framework I'd written that only I fully understood. When Arkite crossed a $3 billion valuation, I didn't celebrate like the others. I just watched the dashboard run smoothly and felt a quiet pride. The kind you feel when you step back and see something you built brick by brick finally standing tall. During all that time, Dominic existed in a completely separate universe. He lived in Boston, drifting through social events and lifestyle content creation. Dennis talked about him occasionally, pride mixed with something else I couldn't quite identify. But he never once suggested bringing Dominic into the company. Everything felt clear. I managed the technical foundation. Dennis managed the business side. Dominic managed being Dominic. But as Arkite grew, pressure from the board intensified. They wanted succession planning, a younger, leadership presence, and a family narrative that investors could package neatly. I started noticing shifts in Dennis's tone whenever Dominic's name came up. Not because Dennis wanted this, but because he was being pushed toward it by forces larger than his own preferences. I saw it clearly this morning in the conference room. The way Dennis avoided my gaze when he announced Dominic as Chief Innovation Officer wasn't pride. It was the look of a man cornered between family loyalty and the person who had built the foundation with him. Sitting at my desk, staring at the fractured code Dominic had touched, something inside me shifted. Maybe Dennis wasn't the same person from that cramped office with the failing server rack. And maybe I wasn't the young engineer who believed every promise carried equal weight. But one thing became undeniable. The hardest challenges of my career weren't behind me. They were standing directly ahead, wearing an expensive suit and a confident smile that couldn't hide incompetence. The following week, I arrived earlier than usual. Maybe I wanted space to prepare for what I knew was coming. The first leadership meeting under Dominic's watch. The entire engineering team filed in slowly, expressions tight, bodies tense. We all understood this wouldn't be a normal technical discussion. Dominic entered holding a presentation remote like a keynote speaker at a tech summit. The first slide appeared. Bold letters read, "Revolutionary Vision for Arkite 2.0." Below that were words like exponential growth, next-generation thinking, and paradigm shift. An engineer across from me exhaled slowly. We all knew this meeting would focus on performance, not substance. Dominic's opening wasn't terrible. He discussed market trends, competitive positioning, and the urgency of staying ahead. He knew how to frame concepts so the room felt like witnessing something significant. I'll admit, he had a talent for presentation. If he'd stopped there, I might have felt some relief. But the real issues surfaced when he started explaining Arkite's technical architecture. The diagrams he showed were conceptual, disconnected from our actual infrastructure. Numbers appeared without context or explanation. He claimed our API layer needed optimization when the bottleneck clearly existed in the caching strategy. Several engineers exchanged quick glances, but no one interrupted. Our company culture valued order, especially with Dennis present. By the 10th slide, absurdity arrived. Dominic pointed to a feature and announced it would be our breakthrough focus for the next quarter. I recognized it instantly. It was a module I'd built 7 years ago when Arkite was fighting to retain its first enterprise client. A few people lowered their heads to hide smiles. I said nothing. I wondered whether Dominic had done this deliberately or simply didn't understand the system he was supposed to lead. When the presentation concluded, Dennis applauded. First, he praised Dominic's energy and called it exactly the kind of forward-thinking Arkite needed. I looked at Dennis and understood he wasn't speaking from conviction. He was trapped between expectation and reality. After the meeting, Dominic approached me with a progress report he'd sent to investors the previous night. When I opened it, I recognized everything inside. These were optimizations I'd completed the week before his appointment. I'd fixed critical bugs, restructured database queries, and improved response times across the platform. Dominic had simply attached his name and sent it as his own achievement. The feeling wasn't anger. It was the sensation you get when you see a carefully built structure starting to lean in the wrong direction. Dominic noticed my expression and misread it as surprise. He said this was just the beginning, that I needed to adapt to his new approach. I smiled politely, a smile that concealed disappointment I couldn't afford to show. In the days that followed, patterns emerged. The office atmosphere tightened. Board members appeared more frequently, asking detailed questions about recent changes. They never said it directly, but the way they observed Dominic revealed their doubts clearly. Dennis tried defending his son, but there was a flicker in his eyes I'd never seen before, a quiet, restless uncertainty. I kept working normally, monitoring logs and reviewing every change Dominic pushed through. Those changes rarely caused immediate failures, but after years of studying architecture, you learn to recognize danger before it fully manifests. A few rushed implementations, a few shortcuts in testing protocols, a few documentation updates that were skipped entirely. Small things, but small things create fractures in foundations that once felt unbreakable. I stayed silent. No one asked for my input. Perhaps because they already knew truth stops mattering once it conflicts with preferred narratives. One evening, long after everyone else had left, I remained at my desk. Log entries scrolled across my screen. I watched them like a pulse, the heartbeat of something I'd helped create, and I knew exactly what I was witnessing. Dominic had skills, but not the ones the company needed. And when you place the wrong person in a critical role, collapse becomes a question of timing, not possibility. I turned off my monitor and stood. The silence made my own breathing sound louder. What happened in that meeting wasn't just a leadership transition, it was the beginning of something larger, something I couldn't name yet, but would recognize soon enough. In that dim office, for the first time, I felt a fracture inside myself begin to widen. It was the start of something I would eventually have to face once events unfolded exactly as I now expected. The shift became clearer over the following weeks. Dominic kept pushing the team harder, stacking meetings relentlessly and demanding faster timelines for every project. He was obsessed with launching a major platform update, something he claimed would position Arkite as an industry leader. The real problem was his focus on speed at the expense of everything else. Our security protocol originally included 5 testing phases: penetration testing, vulnerability scans, load simulations, integration checks, and compliance audits. Dominic reduced it to 2. In one meeting, he said markets don't wait for perfection and the competitors would pass us if we didn't move aggressively. I watched him speak with the confidence of someone who had never witnessed what happens when you rush critical infrastructure. A few engineers tried explaining that our legacy systems required thorough testing, but Dominic dismissed them, insisting our old processes were outdated and incompatible with modern development cycles. I stayed quiet, not because I agreed, but because I knew any objection from me would be labeled resistance to change. The update was deployed on a Friday afternoon. I remember the office lights still glowing, but the atmosphere felt like the calm before a catastrophic storm. I opened the system logs and watched waves of changes push through without proper documentation. Dominic stood near the main display, proud as if about to witness a technological breakthrough. Engineers exchanged worried glances. Everyone understood deploying at week's end was dangerous, but Dominic insisted it was ideal timing because user activity dropped and issues could be addressed quietly over the weekend. It took less than 6 hours for everything to unravel. That evening, just as I was leaving, an urgent alert lit up the monitoring dashboard. Massive unauthorized data access was occurring across multiple user accounts. I opened the logs and saw anomalous commands executing in areas that should have been protected by our testing modules. I knew immediately this wasn't a minor glitch. It was a severe security breach. Within 2 hours, tech media outlets began reporting. Major accounts broke the story before the company could respond. By midnight, every major news site had covered it. Arkite Technologies suffers a catastrophic data breach following a major update. The attached screenshot showed a dashboard I knew intimately, now displaying a cold message: user data temporarily inaccessible. A failure you only see in reckless companies, and I knew exactly who had pushed that update. I kept reading. The update was described as an ambitious technological advancement from the new Chief Innovation Officer. But I understood the truth. I understood the type of person who launches critical updates on Friday afternoon to prove something. And I understood the type who ignores every warning because ego demands visibility. What shocked me was the scale of damage. User data across the entire platform became unreachable. Companies relying on Arkite for operational analytics were paralyzed. Some manufacturing firms lost production forecasts, disrupting entire supply chains. Online, people whispered what Arkite refused to admit. Arkite is collapsing. One comment read, "Using Arkite now feels like gambling with your business." I didn't feel satisfaction, but I wasn't surprised. By mid-morning, investigative articles appeared. They cited anonymous sources saying Dominic had bypassed critical testing protocols, confident his new architecture was superior. Engineers posted on forums claiming the update had been deployed without team approval. I read every line and felt like I was watching scenes from a disaster I'd tried to prevent months earlier. Then, my phone rang. Colin, the back-end engineer. His voice was tight. "Jeffrey, it's chaos here. The board is demanding answers. Dominic is blaming everything except his own decisions." I closed my eyes. I could picture it perfectly. The tense boardroom. Dominic was standing there talking quickly, deflecting responsibility with phrases borrowed from business theory. None of it touching the actual technical failure. I knew that behavior. When systems run smoothly, anyone can pretend brilliance, but when they collapse, only real competence keeps you standing. By noon, major clients issued public statements. A logistics company announced it was exploring alternative providers. A financial analytics firm suspended all use of Arkite until stability returned. One of them emailed me directly. "Jeffrey, we're interested in discussing alternatives. Are you available?" I stared at that message for a long time, not from excitement, but from something heavier. The realization that what I'd built quietly in my own time now stood exactly where people needed it most. That client had been one of Arkite's earliest supporters. They used to call them a strategic partner. Now they were reaching out to me, someone operating from a small rented office space with modest equipment, because what they needed wasn't prestige. They needed technical integrity. By late afternoon, media coverage intensified. Internal sources claimed Dominic had been confronted in a board meeting and questioned about architecture, testing, and deployment decisions. Someone reported he'd lost composure and claimed the engineering team lacked the skill to understand his vision. A single sentence thrown at the wrong moment pours gasoline on fire. I didn't feel triumph reading it. I didn't feel sorrow either. I felt clarity. In engineering, systems don't forgive arrogance. You can't write code to impress a boardroom. Code doesn't care about your last name, your connections, or your confident presentations. Code runs only when written correctly. By evening, social media was filled with sarcasm and resignation. Someone wrote, "Arkite should rehire whoever built their original system." Another said, "Technology isn't a stage for ego. It demands real understanding." I thought about Dennis. For 15 years, he hadn't been a bad person, just a father who made the wrong choice. I knew he must be sitting in that office now, watching his son be exposed by the very system he had handed over. Near 8 that night, as I organized documents in preparation for a client meeting, my phone buzzed. Unknown number, but the area code was familiar. Dennis. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice was rough, stripped of the confidence I'd known for 15 years. "Jeffrey, I'm in town. I need to see you. Please." I didn't answer immediately. I stood by the window watching the city below. People were walking, eating dinner, and laughing as if a platform serving millions hadn't just collapsed. The world is wide enough that one company's failure barely slows it down. Finally, I said calmly, "Dennis, I'm busy tomorrow. If you want to meet at 9 in the morning, my office is small. Don't expect anything impressive." He exhaled, the sound of someone drowning who just heard a rope land nearby. "Thank you. I'll be there." I hung up. Not joyful, not bitter, just aware of one undeniable truth. Everything was falling back into place. Arkite was paying the price for misplaced trust. My small operation was rising on actual competence. And Dennis, the man who once believed I could be replaced by anyone sharing his last name, was coming to see me. Not from pity, from necessity. Dennis arrived at 9 exactly. I heard him pause outside before knocking. When I opened the door, I didn't see the founder of Arkite Technologies, the man who once commanded rooms and earned investor applause. I saw a father worn down completely. Dennis looked around the modest office, the simple desk, and the single server humming in the corner, then back at me. Deep hurt filled his eyes. Not from company failure, but something far more personal, a realization that arrived too late. "Jeffrey, thank you for seeing me." His voice was low and rough, like he hadn't slept in days. I gestured for him to sit. No coffee, no formalities, just two people who spent 15 years building something together, now sitting across a table finalizing a quiet ending. Dennis spoke first. "I was wrong." The words weren't loud or shaky, just heavy. "I protected Dominic too much. I thought time would teach him. I thought you could endure until things stabilized." I didn't nod. I didn't react. Partly because I'd known this for months, partly because apologies arriving too late often feel hollow. Then he said what I'd expected since his call last night. "Jeffrey, Arkite is dying. The board wants Dominic removed. Projects are gone. You've seen the coverage. I need you. The company needs you. Come back." He stopped, looking at me like someone clinging to the last rope available. "I'll give you whatever you want. Salary, title, equity, and decision authority. Anything." I set down my pen and looked straight at him, not angry, not bitter, just clear in a way that took 15 years to reach. "Dennis, you replaced me with your son. Now let him fix every line I wrote." Silence filled the room. Not tense, not threatening. Just the kind of silence truth creates when it lands exactly where it should. Dennis didn't respond immediately. I watched his face fall piece by piece, like he finally understood the cost of choosing bloodline over competence. "Jeffrey, if I could go back," he never finished. "Some apologies can't be completed because they depend on hypotheticals, and life doesn't offer rewinds." I stood and opened the door. Dennis understood. He rose slowly, moving like someone who'd lost more than a company. Before stepping out, he turned back, eyes red, but voice strangely steady. "I'm sorry for not protecting you, and I'm sorry I let it reach this point." I nodded slightly. Not forgiveness, not resentment, just acknowledgement that our story had reached its final page. After he left, I sat at my desk for a long time. I thought about the nights we ran infrastructure tests until dawn, about the days when Arkite operated from a cramped garage, about the promise. He once made that. When we went public, I'd have equity reflecting my contributions, and about the man who just sat across from me, no longer the leader I once admired, but someone who'd lost what he built with his own hands. But that was no longer my story. 3 weeks later, Arkite Technologies filed for restructuring. The news hit the industry like a controlled detonation. Articles dissected everything: failed risk management, ignored testing protocols, leadership driven by nepotism, and the disastrous update deployed by Dominic. My name appeared once, near the end of most articles. The former lead architect left the company before the incident. No blame, no speculation, just truth. Dominic disappeared from the industry shortly after. Some said he moved into consulting. Others said he took a position at a small startup in another state. I never checked. I didn't need to. When someone misunderstands the nature of work, the work itself teaches the lesson. No additional punishment required. One evening, I stood by the window in my small office watching the city lights below. The system I'd built was running smoothly. The server hummed with steady breath, something healthy and growing. Justice, I realized, doesn't always make noise. Sometimes it's simply you standing still, staying silent, and letting time handle everything. And when the moment arrives, it puts everything back where it belongs. My new data center wasn't large, just 3 rows of server racks standing parallel. But every time I walked inside, I felt like I was standing in the heart of something alive. Fans hummed steadily. Green indicator lights blinked in synchronized rhythm. No chaos, no emergency alerts like those final nights at Arkite. Only smoothness, precision, and systems behaving exactly as designed. That morning, I stood in the center, my hand resting against cool metal. Outside, the city woke slowly, sunlight spilling across buildings. Colin was in the conference room preparing. Client reports. 2 junior engineers reviewed the next deployment in the hallway. My operation wasn't large, but every person contributed to its steady pulse. A young programmer named Andrew stepped into the room holding his laptop carefully, as if afraid of disturbing something sacred. "Jeffrey, can I ask you something?" I turned to him. He looked at me with curiosity mixed with hesitation, the same expression I'd had the first time I entered Arkite's server room years ago. "Go ahead." He pointed at the blinking green lights. "Do you ever regret it? Leaving Arkite, I mean." I'd expected this question eventually. When it finally came, I didn't need time to think. I looked at the systems running in front of us and answered naturally. Regret? No. If old platforms never collapse, you never have reason to build new ones. Andrew frowned slightly, unwrapping the deeper meaning. I smiled and continued. Every system has a life cycle. Eventually it grows too heavy, too dependent on compromises, and you can't fix it anymore. You only patch it. People are the same. When Arkite collapsed, it wasn't just the system failing. It was a reminder I'd stayed in the wrong place too long. I pointed at the server racks. And the beautiful part? You get to rebuild from scratch. Cleaner, leaner, better. Andrew nodded slowly, understanding something larger than his original question. Then he smiled. I get it. This new system, it's like your home. I didn't answer, but he was right. This wasn't revenge. It was a return to responsible work, a return to principles that never cut corners, a return to the belief that technology should have integrity, and a return to myself. Before Andrew left, he turned back. "So what about Arkite now?" I let out a quiet breath, light but not sad. "They'll restructure. Dominic is out of the industry. Anyone choosing shortcuts to prove themselves eventually learns the real lesson. He didn't ask for more. Some truths don't need emphasis. Time has already been explained. I stayed alone in the data center watching green lights blink. My favorite color in technology. The color of systems that live. The color of stability. The color of things built the right way with the right spirit for the right reasons. No one knew I'd stood in Arkite's data center hundreds of times with weight on my chest, hoping the system would hold just one more week. But this time felt different. I wasn't hoping. I wasn't afraid. I was simply witnessing. And I understood why my story had to take this path. I watched the lights run their quiet rhythm and whispered to myself, "Justice doesn't require noise. It only requires time. Not explosions, not revenge. Just time returning everything to its rightful place." Arkite had completed the life cycle it chose. My company was growing into the values it was built on. I stepped out and closed the door. The hallway was softly lit. No frantic footsteps, no emergency meetings, just work. Waiting, steady, honest, and exactly on rhythm. Before returning to my desk, I checked my phone and skimmed reactions to a recent article about my company. Most praised the engineering and the system's performance, but one comment stood out. "You don't need to shout to prove justice. Sometimes you just stay still and let the truth speak." I smiled. They didn't know my story, but somehow they'd summarized it perfectly. Before I went back to work, I wanted to share something with you. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel and tell me where you're listening from. I genuinely value the journey each story travels, whether it's a line of code, a lesson learned, or a moment that makes you nod quietly to yourself. Because sometimes one right story at the right time is enough to change the foundation you're standing on.